The morning she knelt on the cold flags of a kitchen that was not her own, with a brush in her raw hand and a pail of grey water going colder beside her. Honora Vane was 8 days from a wedding. The whole of the county believed she wanted. No one in that scullery knew her. That was the entire point. The cap pinned low over her brown hair, the coarse apron, the grey stuff gown borrowed from a girl 2 inches shorter. All of it had been chosen so that she might pass through the great house at Ashcombe Court as nothing at all, as a hired pair of hands taken on for the press of the coming festivities and be looked through by every soul in it. She had told herself she came only to see the place that would be her home. She had not told herself the truer thing, which was that she had begun, in the quiet of the last fortnight, to be afraid. She scrubbed. The flags came up clean under her brush, and then dirtied again where her knees dragged the water, and she worked the way she had taught herself to work in the long, bad year after her father died, steadily, without looking at the size of the task. Above her, somewhere through the green baize door, the family she was to marry into were taking chocolate in a warm room she had not been shown. She could hear the house breathing around her, the slap of a cook's cleaver, the rattle of a coal scuttle, a footman whistling a tune. He stopped when the butler passed. To the household of Ashcombe she was a new girl, plain and silent, and the room had decided she was simple because she did not chatter and did not lift her eyes. What none of them could have guessed was that the plain girl on her knees, held in the funds and the unentailed acres her father had left her, very nearly £40,000. She had not always meant to deceive anyone. The notion had come to her sideways. The week before, when her aunt had said over the teacups that the Earl of Ashcombe was marrying her chiefly for her sense, which was a kind thing to say, and which Honora had wanted very much to believe. She was 24, not a girl in her first season, and she knew what she was on the marriage market, a respectable fortune attached to a quiet woman past the first bloom of fashion. The Earl Julian Hartley had courted her with a gravity that had felt, at the time, like respect. He did not flatter. He did not press her hand too long. He spoke to her of the management of land and the education of tenants' children as though she were a person whose opinion might matter. And she had let herself hope, cautiously, the way one tests ice, that she had been seen. Then, a letter had gone astray. It was nothing. A single sheet that had slipped from a packet her aunt was forwarding, and Honora had read 3 lines of it before she understood it was not meant for her eyes. It was from a Mrs. Foley, a connection of the Ashcombe family, to another lady, and it spoke of the coming match with a satisfaction that had nothing warm in it. The Earl, the writer observed, had managed the business cleverly, and the Vane fortune would set the estate to rights, and the girl herself was no trouble, being too dull to notice she had been bought. Honora had folded the letter very small. She had not wept. She had simply sat in the window of her aunt's morning room and understood, with the cold clarity of a person who has been told a thing she half suspected, that she did not actually know the man she was going to marry, nor what he and his people said of her when the doors were shut. So she had come to find out. It was an improper thing, a mad thing, and she had done it anyway. And now here she was, on the floor of his kitchen, with the truth somewhere above her in a warm, bright room, and she meant to hear it in his own voice before she stood up in a church and gave him everything she had. The housekeeper at Ashcombe was a Mrs. Pell, a spare upright woman of 60, with a bunch of keys at her waist, in a manner that brooked no foolishness, and it was Mrs. Pell who had hired the new girl at the back door without a single question past her name, which Honora had given as Nora. There was kindness in the woman under the starch. On that first morning she stood over Honora's scrubbing, with her arms folded and her head on one side, and after a while she said not unkindly that the new girl had soft hands for scullery work, and had best toughen them before they cracked, and she sent down a pot of mutton fat to rub into the splits the brush had already opened across Honora's knuckles. Honora thanked her and kept her eyes down, and felt absurdly the prick of tears, because no one in her own house had thought to be gentle with her hands in a long while. If you have ever stood quietly at the edge of a room where people were deciding your worth without knowing you could hear, you already understand why she stayed down on those flags, long after they were clean. Stay with her a moment. What she heard before that week was out would cost more than the wedding. The house was full to the rafters, for the Earl's grandmother, the Dowager Countess of Ashcombe, had come down from town for the wedding, and brought half her establishment with her. And where the Dowager went, there came also her favorite, a Miss Cassandra Ray, a beauty of 19, with hair the color of New Guineas and a laugh that carried down corridors. Honora learned the shape of the household, the way a servant learns it, from below, by which bells rang and how long the family sat at dinner, and whose tray went up untouched. She learned that the Dowager ruled the upper floors absolutely. She learned that Miss Ray was forever at the Dowager's elbow, and that the two of them spoke of the bride who was coming with a particular bright contempt that the upper servants had learned not to repeat. She learned, too, that the Earl was not often in the house. He rose before the rest and rode the estate in the early dark, and he came back muddied to the knee and went straight to his study. And the maid said he had been a different man since his wife died. Honora had known he was a widower. She had not known, until a laundry maid told her over the steam of the coppers, that the first countess had died in childbed 3 years gone, and the child with her, and that his lordship had not had the nursery opened since, and kept the door of it locked, and was believed by the household to keep the key on his own person and to go in alone, very late. That was the first thing Honora had not been told, and it sat oddly in her. This man she had thought she understood, carrying a locked room about with him on a ring of keys. The second thing she heard 4 days into her service, and it was the thing she had come for, and it was worse than the letter. She had been sent up with coals for the small saloon, because a maid was sick, and Mrs. Pell was short of hands, and she had been warned to be quick and silent and to keep to the edges of the room. She knelt at the grate with the scuttle and made up the fire, and the Dowager Countess sat at her embroidery not 3 yards off, with Miss Ray beside her, and neither of them so much as glanced at the girl on the hearth, because a girl on the hearth was a piece of the furniture that happened to move. And so Honora heard them speak of her as though she were not in England at all. The Dowager spoke first, in the dry, pleasant voice of a woman who has never once doubted her right to arrange the lives of others. The vain girl would do, she said, for what she was wanted for. The fortune was sound, the lawyers had seen to it, and a plain dull wife was no bad thing in a house that had already buried a pretty clever one. Miss Ray laughed her bright laugh at that. And what a mercy, she said, that the creature was so very meek, for it would make the rest so much easier. And the Dowager said, yes, that was the whole of her value, that she would not notice, and would sign what she was asked to sign, and would be grateful to the end of her dull life for having been taken at all. Honora's hands did not shake. She set the last coal with the tongs, as though her whole attention were on the fire. The blood had gone from her face, though. She could feel it leave, the cold traveling down from her scalp, and her heart was beating so high in her throat that she was certain they must hear it. 2 ladies 3 yards away, discussing the disposal of her, like a parcel of land. She did not yet know the half of what they intended. She only knew the temper of it. And the temper was enough. It was then, kneeling at the cold edge of that warm room, with the scuttle empty in her hands, that the Earl came in. He came in muddied from the ride, which was improper in his grandmother's saloon, and which he plainly did not care about. And he stopped just inside the door because there was a servant at the grate, and a gentleman waits for a servant to finish and withdraw. Honora kept her head down. She gathered the scuttle and the cloth, and she rose, and for one moment crossing the room to the door with her eyes lowered, she passed within a yard of the man she was to marry, and he looked at her. She felt it before she understood it, the particular weight of a look that has caught on something. She did not raise her eyes. She went out through the door and down the back stair and stood in the cold of the passage with her back against the stone. And she told herself he had looked at her the way any man looks at a clumsy maid who has lingered too long at his grandmother's fire. She told herself that her body did not believe it. Her body had felt the look land like a hand between the shoulder blades, and it stood her against the wall and would not let her go on until her breath came level. What had happened, though she could not know it from the passage, was this. Julian Hartley had glanced at the maid by the fire as a man glances at anything that moves, and then he had looked again, because something in the set of her shoulders, the straight, grave way she carried her head, even bent over the coals, did not belong to a scullery girl. He had not placed it. He had thought only, in the half-formed way of a tired man, that there was a person under that cap, and that the household ran people like her to the bone, and he had felt the old useless anger he felt at things he could not mend. Then she had gone, and his grandmother had begun to talk of the wedding, and he had let the thought sink, as he let most things sink, beneath the still gray surface. He showed the world. The next morning Honora woke before light in the cold attic. She shared with 2 other maids, and lay looking at the slope of the roof, and did the sum that the saloon had set her. The marriage was a transaction. She had suspected it, and now she had heard it confirmed in the dowager's own voice. And the only question left was whether the Earl himself held the same view, or whether he was, as she had let herself hope, a better man than his people. She did not see how she could marry him without knowing. She did not see how she could ask. She could only stay and watch and let the house show her what it was. So she stayed, and the house went on showing her things, and most of them complicated the simple ruin the saloon had made of her hopes. She saw the Earl in the stable yard at dawn, lift a stable boy's little sister onto the back of an old quiet pony, and walk the beast round the cobbles, with one hand at the child's waist, and his face, for once, not still at all. She saw him stand a long while at a tenant's door in the rain, because the man inside was dying, and the man's wife wanted someone of consequence to sit with her, and he sat. She heard from Mrs. Ember, Pell, who unbent a little of an evening over the servants' supper, that his lordship had cut his own jointure to the bone to keep 3 failing farms from the hammer, and that the debt the vain fortune was meant to mend was not his own extravagance but his late father's, and that he had told the dowager to her face that he would sell his hunters before he turned off a single family that had served the estate. None of that was the conduct of a man who would marry a woman for £40,000 and despise her for it, and yet the dowager's voice in the saloon had been so sure. On the 5th day she carried a tray of broth to the housekeeper's room, and found Mrs. Pell weeping, which she had not thought the woman capable of, and the cause of it was a letter from her own daughter, who was in service in the north, and had been turned off without a character on the word of a mistress who had taken against her. Miss Pell was 60, and could no more help her girl than fly, and she sat with the letter in her lap, and the broth going cold, and said that the world had no mercy in it for women without a man or a fortune to stand behind them, and Honora, who had both and had never once felt the safety they were supposed to confer, sat down beside her on the hard chair and took the older woman's hand. She should not have done it. A scullery girl does not take the housekeeper's hand. She did it anyway, and she said, in a voice that came out steadier than she felt, that she would think on it, that there might be a place to be found, that a good servant turned off unjustly was not without friends in the world even when it felt so. And she meant it, because she had the means to mean it, and Mrs. Baldenshire. Pell looked at her strangely for a moment, at the soft hands and the level voice and the something in the new girl that did not fit the cap, and then she only pressed Honora's fingers and said she was a kind child and to get on with her work before the broth was wanted elsewhere. Honora got on with her work. She carried Mrs. Pell's daughter in her mind, though, like a coal in a pocket, and she began, without quite admitting it, to think less about the wedding and more about what a woman with £40,000 might do with it that was not signing it over to a family who thought her dull. She had not reckoned on being seen. It was the Earl who saw her, and he saw her twice more before the week was out, and each time the thing that had caught in the saloon caught a little harder. The second time was in the long gallery, where she had been set to dust the picture frames and had stopped, not knowing she was watched, before the portrait of the first countess. It hung at the gallery's far end, a fair, grave young woman with a child's coral teether painted into her hand, and Honora had stood before it longer than dusting required, because she had been thinking of the locked nursery, and the man who carried its key. And her face, when she did not know it was observed, was not the blank face of a servant, but the open, thinking face of a woman feeling something complicated on another's behalf. The Earl come in silently at the gallery's other end, watched the new maid look at his dead wife's portrait with pity and not with curiosity, and something moved in his chest that had not moved in 3 years, and he went away again without a word and was angry with himself the rest of the day. The third time he did not go away. It was late, past 11, and Honora had been kept up to help carry the last of the supper things down, and coming back along the cold corridor that ran past the locked nursery, she had found the Earl standing at its door, with the key in his hand, and his head bowed, not going in, only standing. Tall man in his shirt sleeves with the candle throwing his shadow long up the wall. She ought to have gone by with her eyes down. She had got past such a thing before. He turned at her step, though, and the candlelight was full on his face, and there was such plain, undefended grief in it, the grief he never let the house see, that she stopped without meaning to, and the two of them stood looking at one another in the dark passage. The Earl and the woman he was to marry. He spoke first. He asked her low what she did abroad so late, and she said the supper things, my lord, and her voice in her own ears was wrong, too clear, too educated, and she saw him hear it. He looked at her the way a man looks at a sum that will not come right. Then, instead of dismissing her, he said, a strange thing. He said the house was hard on its servants, and he was sorry for it, and that she should go to her bed and not be kept to such hours again, and he would speak to Mrs. Pell. It was a command, in the shape of an apology, in the shape of care. Come inside out of the cold of the world, it meant, though the words were only go to your bed. Honora stood in the candlelight and felt the whole careful structure of her resentment shift under her like ice on a thawing pond. She said, my lord, the lady in the gallery. She had not meant to say it. It came out of her before her judgment could stop it. And the Earl went very still, and for a moment she thought she had ruined everything, that he would call her impertinent and have her turned off in the morning, and a part of her, the tired part, almost wished it. Instead he looked at the locked door, and then at the strange grave maid who had soft hands and a gentlewoman's voice and pity in her face. And he said, in a tone gone low and even, that the lady in the gallery had been his wife, and that she had died because he had been too proud to send for the London man in time, and had trusted the local doctor who told him there was no cause for alarm. He had not said it aloud to anyone in 3 years. He said it to a servant in a dark passage because she had asked, and because something in her face made it possible, and when he had said it, he looked almost frightened, as a man does who has set down a weight he had forgotten he could put down. There. That was the wound, named once, and Honora carried it away with her down the cold stair, and it changed the shape of everything, because a man who blamed himself like that for a death he could not have prevented was not a man who bought wives and despised them. He was a man so walled, against feeling that his own grandmother had mistaken the wall for the house. She lay awake the rest of that night and understood that she had come to Ashcombe to catch a villain, and had found instead a grieving man, a kind household, a housekeeper with a ruined daughter, and a fortune of her own that she had never once thought of as power until she saw how little safety it had bought the women around her who had none. The wedding was 4 days off. She still did not know whether the Earl meant the marriage, as the Dowager meant it. She knew now, though, that she could not learn it, as Nora the scullery maid, and she knew with a sinking of the heart that she would soon have to stop being Nora, and that when she did, the man in the passage would learn that the woman who had pitied his wife and heard his confession was the dull heiress his grandmother meant to buy. The unmasking did not come the way she had planned it. She had meant to slip away, to resume herself quietly at her aunt's, to meet the Earl again as Miss Vane with everything she had learned hidden behind her eyes. The Dowager arranged it otherwise. It was the day before the wedding, and the house was at its fullest, and a great dinner had been called to mark the eve of the match, with 30 at the table, the bride herself expected down from her aunt's that afternoon to be presented to the company. Honora, of course, was not at her aunt's. Honora was in the scullery, and the bride who did not arrive threw the whole upper house into confusion, and a rider was sent, and word came back that Miss Vane had taken ill and could not come, which was the message Honora had paid a village boy to carry, buying herself one more day. And in the flurry of it the dowager came down in person to the kitchen passage, which she never did, to Harry the cook. And Miss Ray came with her, and the two of them stood in the stone passage in their silks among the steam and the running servants. And there, in the press, Miss Ray's eye fell on the new scullery girl carrying a tureen. And her bright laugh stopped in her throat. For Cassandra Ray had been 3 seasons in town, and had been at the same assemblies as the vain heiress. And though she had never troubled to speak to a plain woman of no fashion, she had a beauty's exact memory for every other woman in any room, and she knew Honora's face under the cap as one knows a thing one has half forgotten and suddenly placed. She said the name aloud before she could think better of it. She said it as a question, Miss Vane, in a voice gone shrill with disbelief, and the stone passage rang with it, and every servant in it stopped, and the dowager turned, and Honora stood with the tureen in her cracked hands and her cap askew, and knew that the week was over. She might have lied. She was good at being looked through. She was tired of being looked through, though, tired to the bone of it, and so she set the tureen down on the dresser with great care, and she straightened, and she took off the cap, and she let them see her, and she said in her own voice, which was clear and educated, and not at all the voice of a scullery girl, that, yes, she was Honora Vane, and she had been a week in this house, scrubbing its floors, and she had heard a great many things from the hearthstones that the family had not meant the floors to hear. The Dowager Countess did not fragment all at once. She was made of harder stuff than that. Her face went the color of tallow, and then she gathered herself and said, in the dry, pleasant voice with all the pleasure gone out of it, that the girl was clearly unwell, that this was some hysteria of the nerves, that Miss Vane must be taken upstairs and put to bed and a doctor sent for. And she said it loudly, for the benefit of the servants, to make the truth into a madness, before it could spread. And Honora, standing in the steam in her gray gown, understood that the next minute would decide the rest of her life, and that she had no ally in that passage but herself. It was the worst moment, and she met it alone, and that was the point of it. No one came down the stair to save her. The Earl was not there. There was only Honora in a borrowed gown with her own fortune behind her, and her own week of knowledge in her facing a great lady who meant to call her mad in front of 40 witnesses, and she felt the old wound open, the message her whole life had pressed into her, that she was a thing to be managed, too dull to notice, easily put away. She felt it open, and she did not let it close her mouth. She said quite quietly, into the ringing passage, that she was not unwell, and that she had heard the dowager say, in the small saloon 4 days since, that her whole value was that she would not notice, and would sign what she was asked, and would be grateful for it to the end of her dull life. She repeated the words, exactly. She had a good memory, the vain sense her aunt had praised, and she gave the dowager her own sentence back to her, in the dowager's own cadence, and the color that had come back into the old woman's face went out of it again, because a thing said in a closed saloon is deniable, and a thing repeated word for word by the person it was said of is not. The passage was utterly silent. The cook had stopped with her ladle in the air. Mrs. Forbus. Pell had come to the door of her room and stood with her hand at her throat, looking at the scullery girl who had taken her hand and promised to think on her daughter, and understanding all at once who the girl had been. And it was into that silence, drawn down by the unnatural quiet, where there should have been the din of a dinner being served, that the Earl came at last, down the back stair, 2 at a time, because a footman had run to him with a tale too strange to credit, and he stopped on the bottom step and saw, in the steam and the stopped bustle of his own kitchen passage, the maid from the gallery, and the passage and the locked nursery door standing bareheaded in a grey gown, and heard his grandmother call her Miss Vane. He did not understand it in one piece. No one could have. He understood enough, though, standing on the stair, to see that the woman he had confessed his deepest grief to in a dark corridor was the woman he was to marry in the morning, and that she had come into his house in disguise to learn the truth of him, and that his grandmother was at this moment trying to have her declared mad to bury what she had heard. He looked from the dowager to Honora and back, and the household watched him do it, and the whole weight of the thing the dowager had built, the bought wife, the managed estate, the meek girl who would sign what she was asked, hung in the steam between them, waiting to see which way he would let it fall. What she did not know, in that long-held moment, was that the look had decided it days before. He crossed the passage. He did not hurry, and he did not make a speech, and he did not so much as raise his voice at his grandmother, all of which Honora had braced for. He crossed the wet stone floor of his own scullery in front of 30 guests' worth of waiting servants, and the cook, and the housekeeper, the beauty in guinea-gold silk, and he stopped before Honora, in her borrowed gray, and he looked at her cracked hands, and her bare head, and her steady, frightened eyes, and he took up one of her ruined hands in both of his, as though it were the only valuable thing in the house. Then he said, the only words he said, in that passage. He said, "This is the woman I will marry, and no one will speak ill of her in my house again." It was not a long speech, it was the whole of it. He said it level and low, not to Honora but to the room, to the dowager and Miss Ray and every listening servant, and it was 11 words, and it could not be unsaid, and it claimed her in front of the very people his grandmother had gathered to witness her being managed. The dowager countess opened her mouth and shut it again. Miss Ray's bright face had gone quite white, and Honora stood with her wrecked hand held in the Earl's 2 hands, and felt the wound that had been open all her life do something she had not known a wound could do, which was begin, very slowly, in the warmth of that grip, to close. The dowager did not stay to be humbled further, and the Earl did not humble her. That was the measure of him, Honora thought afterward, that he took exactly what was needed, and not 1 grain more. He turned to his grandmother, and said only that her things would be packed and a carriage made ready, and that she was always welcome at Ashcombe when she could be civil in it, and the "and not before" was left unspoken and perfectly heard. The dowager drew her shawl about her with what dignity was left her, and went up the stair, and Miss Ray, who had no standing in the house at all once her patroness was leaving it, went up after her with her guinea-gold head bent, and the great eve of wedding dinner went up without its hostess, and was eaten, the servants said, below stairs for years after. 2 in the strangest silence Ashcombe had ever known. Honora did not marry the Earl the next morning. She was firm on that, to his evident bewilderment. When at last the passage had cleared, and he had drawn her into the empty steward's room, and shut the door and stood looking at her as though she might dissolve. She would not marry a man on a morning's notice in the wreck of a deception. She told him even her own deception, even his own honest claiming of her. She had come into his house under a false name, and heard his griefs unguarded, and that was a debt between them, that a hurried wedding would only paper over. She would go back to her aunt. She would let the banns and the gossip do what they would, and in a month or 2, if he still wished it, he might court her properly, as Honora and not as a fortune, and she would answer him properly, as a woman and not as a parcel. The Earl heard her out, and his still gray face did something it rarely did, which was ease into the beginning of a smile, and he said that he had never in his life been refused so thoroughly by a woman he had just publicly betrothed himself to, and that he found he liked it, and that he would wait. He courted her through that autumn, as he had not courted her before, which is to say as though she were a person and not a settlement. He rode to her aunt's twice a week. He brought her no jewels and no flowers, but instead the account books of the 3 failing farms, and asked her who had managed her father's affairs for the bad year, and knew more of drainage and leases than most stewards, what she would do, and listened to her answers, and did half of what she said. He told her in pieces, over those weeks, the things the household had only guessed at, the truth of his father's debts and his wife's death, and the locked nursery, and one gray afternoon he gave her the key to it, simply held it out across the steward's table, and asked her if she would walk through it with him. And she did, and the room was not terrible, only sad. A cradle under holland covers, and a window full of the bare autumn garden. And she opened the shutters and let the gray light in, and he stood in the door and watched her do it, and did not, this time, look frightened. She did not forget Mrs. Pell's daughter. It was nearly the first thing she saw to, before ever she saw to herself. With the freedom her fortune gave her, and no family above her to forbid it, she wrote to the north and made inquiries, and found the girl a place in a good house through a connection of her aunt's, and she settled a small sum on Mrs. Spurdick. Pell, besides, against the woman's furious protests, so that the housekeeper who had sent a pot of mutton fat down to a stranger's cracked hands need never again sit weeping over a letter with no power to answer it. Pell, when she understood what the new mistress meant to do, sat down hard in the housekeeper's chair and put her apron over her face, and when she took it down she only said that she had known there was a person. Under that cap she had said so at the time, and Honora laughed and cried a little, and the matter was settled between them for life. They were married in the early spring, in the small church on the estate, and not the great one in town, with the tenants in the pews and the children of the 3 saved farms throwing the first crocuses of the year, and Mrs. Botter. Pell in the front bench in a new gown that the mistress had given her, and that she pretended not to be proud of. The Dowager Countess did not come, but she sent a letter that was very nearly an apology, which from the Dowager amounted to a full prostration. And Honora wrote back kindly, because she had no wish to win past the point of winning, and a corrected antagonist left in possession of her dignity was a better neighbor than a destroyed one. On the first evening that Ashcombe Court was wholly their own, with the last guest gone, and the house settling around them into the deep quiet of a place at rest, Honora came down alone to the kitchen where the whole strange business had begun. She did not know quite why. The fire was banked low, and the flags she had once scrubbed on her knees gleamed dully in the last of it, and she stood where she had knelt that first cold morning, and felt the distance she had come measured out in that one square of clean stone. She heard a step behind her and did not turn because she knew it. The particular weight of him. The way her body had always known exactly where he was in a room since the first night in the passage. He came and stood beside her and looked at the cold floor and asked her, lo, what she did abroad so late. It was the same question he had asked the maid in the corridor, and he asked it now on purpose, and she heard the whole changed world in it. She said the same answer back to him, the supper things, my lord, and they stood a moment in the firelight, smiling at the thing that had so nearly broken, and had not. Then he drew from his coat the small thing he had carried there for a month, which was not a jewel after all, but the cap she had worn, the plain gray servant's cap which he had taken from the dresser that first wild afternoon and kept, and he gave it back to her, and she understood that he had kept it the way he kept the key, as the marker of a door he had been afraid to open, and had opened after all. She folded the cap small, the way she had once folded a letter that had told her she was nothing. This time, it was the other thing entirely. She set it on the warm stone of the mantel where the firelight could reach it, and she let his arm come round her. The two of them stood in the kitchen of their own house in the falling dark, while the last coal settled in the grate, and outside the window the first soft snow of the new year began, without any sound at all, to come down over the saved farms and the bear garden and the small church where they had married, covering all of it, gently, in white. If Honora's weak on her knees moved you, stay a moment in the quiet of it before you go. And if you would, leave a word below for the housekeeper who sent down the mutton fat to a stranger's cracked hands, for she was, in her way, the first to see